Okie dokie now. We've made it to the 19th century, a time of great economic, technological, social, and political change. And, of course, little old Germany joins in on the fun. By 1815, after the Congress of Vienna attempts to rebuild a war-torn Europe, Prussia and Austria sit as the top dogs in the German Confederation. So now, for important context, I should give a brief rundown of both. The Empire of Austria began as a humble march, that is, a border territory meant to defend a frontier during the Middle Ages. It was, in fact, one of several east of Germany, founded in Slavic lands, where it was given the Latin name Marca Orientalis, the Eastern March. It had a couple names, in fact, but the one that stuck was a Latin version of its native High Dietsch name, Oesterreichi, East Realm, Austria. Austria flung around various noble families, often tied with greater medieval politics, until finally it settled on the Habsburgs with Rudolf I. Austria would also get a few other lands associated with it, collecting the other southeastern Slavic marches, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, though, of course, these were becoming increasingly Dietsch. Rudolf had also been king of Germany and Italy, though not emperor. HRE successions were very complex. His descendant, Frederick V, however, was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1452, beginning some 300 years of Habsburg imperial rule. Frederick's great-grandson, if you remember from 2 episodes ago, was Charles V, Grand Emperor and King of Spain that he was. The Habsburgs, in addition to Austria and the Netherlands and other scattered lands, also became the kings of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia. This collection of titles is often called the Habsburg monarchy, or Austria for short, even though Austria technically was only just a piece. That is, until 1804, when Emperor Francis II made himself also Emperor of Austria, creating an Austrian empire under which all those other kingdoms and duchies and other lands were included. And this man also got to be the world's first and only double emperor, until thankfully in 1806, when he deigned to wear only one imperial crown. This, however, created another awkward situation. The kingdoms of Hungary and Croatia, along with the lands in Poland, Galicia, Lodomeria, Dalmatia, and Lombardy Venetia, were not included within the German Confederation, because they were neither German nor recently part of the Holy Roman Empire, if ever they were, so only Austria proper and Bohemia were included, despite that meaning Czechs and Slovenes, and some Italians, were included in the German Confederation, and the fact that, like, 2/3 of the whole empire wasn't part of the Confederation becomes important for later. Alright, now on to Prussia. Way back in episode 2, we talked about the Baltic Crusades and the Teutonic Knights. Well, come the Reformation, Grand Master Albert Hohenzollern gets interested in Protestantism, converts, manages to remake the lands of the order into his own personal duchy, and becomes Duke of Prussia as a vassal to the King of Poland. 16th century Europe was a riot. This means he wasn't part of the empire, but was German, along with much of his territory. Now, the Margraviate of Brandenburg also had started as a march in the Slavic lands like Austria, this time in the northeast of Germany, and the Margrave, who was also one of the electors of the emperor, happened to be a relative of the new Duke of Prussia. So, when Duke Albert Frederick died in 1618, his relative John Sigismund succeeded. So now he too had a country partially in the empire and partially under Poland. Perfect situation, really. Under some capable elector dukes, as they called themselves, Brandenburg Prussia grew into a major power in Central Europe, able to field an army far in excess of its relatively small size compared to Austria. Frederick I collected on this new power by brokering a deal with Emperor Leopold I. In exchange for military aid during the War of Spanish Succession, Frederick got to call himself king in Prussia. Now, he wasn't king of Prussia. There was only one king in the empire, the King of Bohemia, who happened to be the emperor. And of course, Prussia was technically a part of the Kingdom of Poland. So to keep up this strange feudal charade, the title King in Prussia was invented. It didn't matter much. A few decades later, Frederick the Great called himself King of Prussia, and for good measure invaded Austria for Silesia, and of course joined with Austria and Russia in dismembering the hapless Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, connecting the two main pieces of Prussia. It also gained a bunch of lands in western and central Germany. The Napoleonic Wars walloped Prussia, especially after it had spent the previous century with the strongest, most disciplined army in Europe, but made it out okay at the Congress. Prussia got a huge swath of western Germany, the iron and coal-rich Rhineland, much of Saxony, and Posen in Poland. This thick Prussia almost immediately was destined to oppose Austria. The two, Austria and Prussia, were strangely enough foils to one another. Austria was a dynastic, diplomatic power, gaining its territory by marriage over centuries. Austria was Catholic, and Vienna a center of art and music, and ethnically diverse. Prussia, on the other hand, was militaristic, plain, and practical. Through sheer will, she built a grand army and conquered her way to great power status. Prussia was strongly Protestant, and was more well known for philosophers and generals than agents of high culture, old Fritz notwithstanding. And besides the Polish minority, most of Prussia was ethnically German. But both had begun as marches on the edge of civilized Christendom, extending beyond the Empire and later Confederation. And, as a quick aside, besides these lands under Prussia and Austria, many Germans still lived in the Baltic, within Hungary, and even along the Volga River in Russia after they were invited by Empress Catherine the Great. But no one seriously considered these places as rightful German territory, only the Confederation. And the question of what to do with all those little Germanies came to a head in 1848, when a wave of revolutionary fervor swept across Europe, with a rising class of industrialists, middle-class professionals, and factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. These pops wanted more rights and representation in their heretofore fairly autocratic governments. It was like a second echo of the French Revolution, and while not nearly as long or destructive as that first event, the 1848 Springtime of Nations led to many states adopting liberal constitutions, or just gunning down protesters. It depended on the country. Now, the revolutions were complex and deserved their own discussion, but in Germany, the revolutionaries were animated by nationalism, or the idea that communities that shared similar language, history, and culture constitute a nation, and that a nation ought to have its own country, the nation-state. So they met in Frankfurt in March 1848 to draft a constitution to change the German Confederation into a centralized German empire. Austria didn't seem to be interested in any kind of unification, being that might entail cutting loose their lands outside the Confederation, which happened to be in revolt at the moment. The Frankfurt Parliament offered the imperial crown to King Frederick Wilhelm IV of Prussia. He refused, famously deriding it as a crown from the gutter. He, a monarch appointed to rule by God alone, would not entertain the notion of wearing a crown granted by popular mandate. Perish the thought. Without the support of either Austria or Prussia, this new German empire quickly fell apart to reactionary forces. Split along class lines, the idealistic romantics were mopped up by their aristocratic foes. The revolutionaries became the so-called 48ers, many fleeing overseas to the United States, where things were a little more liberal. Germany would be united, by God, but not with national parliaments or constitutions, with blood and iron, on Prussia's and Otto von Bismarck's terms. Otto von Bismarck was a master statesman, a key figure of the 19th century, and under his leadership he reinforced Prussia's traditional authoritarian militarism, dealing with liberals with a combination of carrots and sticks. Prussia would continue to industrialize, providing railroads to transport and factories to supply its armies. And lucky for him, the concert of Europe declined in the second half of the 19th century. After Napoleon, the great powers, through the Congress of Vienna, attempted to create a Europe where no one power could dominate the others. and the five, Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, would all work to prevent any major conflicts. This worked fairly well for a while, with no wars between the great powers occurring. Everyone else, especially African and Asian countries, was fair game, though. But in the second half of the 19th century, the concert began to falter, not the least because Britain and France decided to attack Russia in the Crimean War in 1853, and France teamed up with Sardinia-Piedmont against Austria in 1859. There's just so many moving parts, but for a decade or so, Bismarck was able to take advantage of a distracted concert. And he gets his chance in 1863 in the Second Schleswig War, where Prussia and Austria wrestled Schleswig-Holstein from Danish control for reasons. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston of Great Britain once reportedly quipped, "Only 3 people have ever really understood that Schleswig-Holstein business. Prince Consort Albert of Great Britain, who is dead, a German professor, who has gone mad, and I, who have forgotten all about it." In any case, Holstein was definitively brought back into Germany, while Schleswig, which since the Middle Ages was part of Denmark, but inhabited by many Germans at this point, was brought along for the ride. But Bismarck wasn't done. Austria was up to some political shenanigans in Schleswig-Holstein, which Bismarck saw as a prime opportunity to roll out his master plan. He had already isolated the Austrians. Prussia was allied with Italy, buddied up with Russia since the motherland was peeved at Austria's support for Britain and France in the Crimean War, and had secured French neutrality. In this masterstroke, Bismarck declared war on Austria in 1866, along with Italy and a few northern German states. Austria was joined by the biggest German states like Bavaria, Hanover, and Saxony, but were no match for the highly militarized Prussia. Austria, for its part, did put up a fight, mainly against the Italians, but unfortunately it's more remembered for the decisive losses in Bohemia. The war lasted 7 weeks. Bismarck had to convince King William I of Prussia against pushing for more gains. Bismarck had a careful strategy here. For their insolence, Prussia annexed Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, Frankfurt, Schleswig-Holstein, and bits and pieces of Bavaria and Hesse-Darmstadt. And the German Confederation was dissolved, with Prussia making its own better version, the North German Federation, including all Germany north of the River Main. The North German Federation was structured as a federation of the various North German states, makes sense. It was far more unified than the preceding confederation, with an upper and lower house and an actual head of state, a president, who, of course, was the King of Prussia. Austria was exiled from German affairs, north and south, thus creating the germ of why Germany and Austria are separate today. But Bismarck, rather than annexing the German part of Austria and reducing Hungary to a puppet in the Balkans, thought it far more prudent to keep Austria as a power in southeastern Europe, a counterweight to Russia in the east and France in the west. The two would eventually become allies in the First World War. At about the same time, France was getting leery at Prussia's expansion, and Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the better Napoleon, attempted to have Bismarck make good on some vague promises of letting France take Belgium and Luxembourg. Napoleon did buy Luxembourg from William III of the Netherlands, also Grand Duke of Luxembourg, but Bismarck intervened. Eventually it was decided German-speaking Luxembourg would be a neutral buffer state, despite, by all rights, it should have become part of the North German Federation. Napoleon also wanted parts of the Rhineland, or maybe all of it, and soon the two countries saw conflict as inevitable. Some Spanish dynastic politics popped up, and Bismarck took the opportunity to leak an edited telegram that inflamed the French people, and forced Napoleon to attack Prussia in 1870. Not that he wasn't itching for a fight. It was a grave strategic mistake. The Franco-Prussian War saw Prussia trounce the French army with superior equipment, tactics, training, organization, and transportation. And to make matters worse, at the Battle of Sedan, Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured. Prussia was still forced to siege Paris, but finally won in January 1871. Napoleon had played right into Bismarck's hands. The French invasion had convinced the anxious southern German states to throw their lot in with Prussia to prevent future French aggression. And for the ultimate flex, following their victory, the various German leaders proclaimed King William of Prussia German Emperor, Deutscher Kaiser, in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. The North German Federation was reorganized into the First German Empire, and the French were forced to cede the German-speaking areas of Alsace and Lorraine, after the French kings had so rudely conquered them in the 17th and 18th centuries. Oh, and France also paid a bunch of money in reparations, which becomes important later. So there it is. The German states were finally unified into a federation, a mighty industrial, cultural, military, and technological giant of late 19th century Europe. It had been a very long time, perhaps 1,000 years, since Germany had this sort of unity. But one kid was missing from the family, Austria. And there's a clear semantic distinction here. The new German state was the German Empire, not the Empire of Germany or Empire of the Germans, and its ruler was the German Emperor. The Emperor of Austria was also a German emperor, but not the German emperor, and a Germany might have implied designs on the German-speaking portion of Austria, which is something Bismarck wished to avoid to warm relations between the two Central European powers. It didn't matter much anyway, because the world would call the new empire Germany, and Austria was Austria, which was having its own troubles with Hungary, creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, which tried, and failed, to focus its nation-building on some sort of unified Danubian identity, transcendent of language, culture, or ethnicity. But obviously this German empire doesn't last, and Germany ends up looking differently today. Why is that? What happened? The 20th century was wild, man. Next time we'll try to tackle that whole can of worms, because Germany ends up being front and center to most every major event, and pays dearly for her sins. Until then, thanks for watching.